YouTube now. Welcome everybody to our Wednesday study session, which still has no name, 10 years in. At year 20, I think we'll think of a name. And I'm going to now I'm going to also record to the cloud, so we'll have a recording. Good morning to everybody. Good morning to those who are on Zoom. Good morning to those who are on YouTube. Welcome Flossie and Jeff, Noel, Philip, Bubba, Michael, and Larry. I don't know if Jane's there as well. And we have a little bit more difficult of a task today because we're studying something that is not as well known as a lot of. We just spent 2 weeks, hi Jane, on the Maccabees games and Jews in sports, which is a wonderful topic. But what we're talking about today is a little less famous, and that, of course, is the Apocrypha. And if you haven't studied the Apocrypha, no worries, you are one of the most, because it is not as studied as anything else pretty much in Judaism, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. I'm not even sure if people have heard of the Apocrypha, but I think many of you have. And so what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about the history of it. We'll talk about the reasons why it's so important, and we'll talk a little bit about the different books in it. So for those of you who don't know, how many of you have heard the word Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha? And if you haven't, no worries. Okay, so you've heard of them. So basically, the Apocrypha is most easily understood, although there are other reasons, as books that didn't make it into the Jewish Bible.
Right.
That's the easiest way. We'll go into some other reasons and but basically they are books. Think of the year 90 CE, 2000, almost 2,000 years ago. The group of rabbis came together and said, these books are in the Bible and these books ain't. And they used the word ain't because they were Southern Jewish, from Southern Jewish Israel. And so the Apocrypha didn't make it into that Bible. Years later, when Jerome was asked by the Pope to finalize the Bible, interestingly enough, he went to Egypt to look at different books as opposed to going to Israel, and found 14 more books that were not written in Hebrew at the time that he put into what we would call the Catholic Bible. So these books, the Apocrypha, are in the Catholic Bible. They are also in the Greek Orthodox Bible. So they're both those, I think most of the Orthodox churches have them. They were taken out of the Protestant Bible by none other than Martin Luther in the 15th century. One of the reasons, which is pertinent to us, that he took them out is he thought by taking out these additional books that Jews didn't read, that the Jews would then become Christian. That one of the main reasons Jews weren't Christian is because the Christians had added these 14 books, which were not legitimately supposed to be in the Bible. And so by doing that, he, of course, changed the Bible, but didn't get any Jews to convert because the Jews said, no, that is not why we're not converting. And then he was really upset at Jews for the rest of his life. I think he did feel a little bit guilt at the end. But so they are basically called the Apocrypha because that means hidden books, which is a very interesting translation, because what does it mean to be hidden books? And that is still a debate as to why it is called this. Now, why are they? Some say because they were hidden because they contained mysterious wisdom that was too sacred and would take time to understand. So it's hidden because, it's just too important. It's kind of like waiting to study Kabbalah to your 40. So that's one of the reasons, but there's other ideas as to why it's considered hidden. Some say it was hidden because it was not for contemporary study, but for the future. Like these books dealt with what was going to happen in the future. So the meanings were hidden until some future point. And so for a very long time, these books were part of the Christian Bible. Then they were part of just the Catholic Bible. Now, where do they come in terms of the Jewish world? It's really interesting because they were not really part of the Jewish world in any fashion. You have to remember the Jewish world really centered on studying the Talmud and the Midrash as a way to read the Bible, a lot less studying the history, a lot less studying ways in which we study in modernity. The way we study things today is really a result of what happened at the end of the 18th and the 19th centuries. When we became more educated, we started looking more at science, and we started to take some of these ideas to the Bible and say, let's look at the Bible from a beyond just religious perspective. When were these books actually written? Who wrote these books? What were the situations going on? What is myth? What is fact? How have these books been edited over the years? Were books combined at different periods? This is all really 19th century stuff. So when you think about it, for 2,000 years, or really 1,900 years after the Bible was written, we looked at it from a very pronounced and very singular way for the most part. Let's look at it through the Talmud. What are the religious meanings? Well, now in the 19th century, that changed quite a bit. The ways we study the Bible in our synagogue are a result of that change in the 19th century. It's no coincidence the Reform movement was founded in the 19th century. So the books that were insignificant, but possibly were known about, I mean, there are a lot of scholars who were probably not even familiar with the fact that the Apocrypha existed, but there were some who definitely knew, especially when it came down to probably the books of the Maccabees and some of the additionals. We'll talk about that. But in the 19th centuries, we start looking at these books, and even though they are not considered holy because they didn't make it into the canon, they have become very important to our understanding of the Jewish world. And probably most importantly, these books are most important to Christians and Jews for the same reason. They really speak about the development of Judaism and Christianity at a very particular point in time. And these books are written and studied around the time that Christianity is being created. So it speaks to the links as to how Judaism and Christianity is separated. And it speaks to very much more clearly what is going on in the Jewish world at this time period. So think about the books being written from the 3rd or 4th century BCE to the 1st century CE. So some of the Apocrypha is written right before those rabbis get together and decide which books make it in. And so they would be the latest books put in the Bible if they made it in. But they speak about something the Bible doesn't. What is going on at that time that really changes the way we look at the world? What is going on at that time with the destruction of the temple and the Romans and Christianity? How are we looking at the world? Because remember, the last of the biblical books are written in the 2nd century BCE at the earliest. Most of the biblical books are written 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, way before. So these books are really bringing history forward a couple hundred years. Another reason, and probably even more significantly as to why these books are so important, is obviously the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found starting in 1947, and, there are all these, actually, they just found some recent ones for the first time in like 60 years. It'll be a while before we get to see what they are, but that'll be really interesting. The Dead Sea Scrolls are from the same period of time as these books are written. And so obviously copies are found. And it really adds to the development, because there are books that are found that are not in the Apocrypha, didn't even make it into the Apocrypha. Remember, Jerome went to, what's the name of the city? Alexandria, when he was trying to finalize the Bible for the Catholic Church, and he chose 14 books that were not in it. But there were other books there that he did not choose. And some of those books are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. What is also, I'm sorry, Jeff, please. And you're on mute, sorry, buddy.
A quick one, Rabbi. I'm sorry, I missed, when was Jerome's trip to Egypt? It
was late 4th century. I don't remember the exact date. I'd say 380, somewhere around there. So let me see if I can find it somewhere in here. I don't know if I have the exact date. Sorry about that. It's easy to look up. I can look it up on the computer. So again, these books were always known in the Christian world. Obviously, even though Martin Luther took them out, he knew they were there, because you got to know they're there to take them out. Later Protestants may not have been familiar with them, because once Martin Luther took them out and there was this big split in the church, probably a lot of Protestants didn't realize that, because not everybody was literate, obviously, that it wasn't there. So now let's go over a little bit more in detail about these scrolls themselves.
Rabbi,
okay? And we will have a test. You will have to know how to spell Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha correctly to stay in this class, Larry.
Yeah. Do we know much about Jerome, why he was chosen? And I mean, I've heard of Saint Jerome, so apparently he was sainted afterwards, but was he chosen by the Pope to do this task, as you say, and I guess this was after Constantine, right? Became Holy Roman Empire, right?
I'm not sure, my familiarity with all these things is very slight. It's more connected to the Apocrypha than what's going on in the Catholic Church. I do know he was chosen specifically by the Pope. So that is true. Why he was chosen, what he'd done, I am not familiar. I have to look that up. Again, I know more about the Apocrypha than I know about I should probably look these things up. They're so hard to find these things. I mean, how can you find out about Jerome in today's world? It seems almost impossible. Oh, there I go. I found it. So, but it would be interesting to look into why he was chosen above everybody else. But obviously, he must have had some sort of connections. I mean, to have that kind of power to be able to select the future books of the Bible is he must have been, pretty high up, or pretty accepted as a scholar.
I guess the library at Alexandria then must have been the repository for all of this, both the what we call the Old Testament plus anything that was related to the New Testament then? Yeah,
it was the New Testament when it was the repository for everything up until the point it was destroyed. And then after it was destroyed, there were still, people going there for study. But yeah, the Alexandria was but they could have easily gone to Israel as well. I mean, that would have been, that's where people were going anyway. So, so again, I don't know why they chose Alexandria. Maybe wanted to be separated. The library was destroyed. When was it destroyed? It was destroyed way before that. So, who remembers when it was destroyed? It was destroyed. What year was it destroyed? Anybody remember? I should probably remember this, but let me look that up real quick. It was destroyed was it Caesar? It was destroyed by Caesar, I guess, in the year 48 BCE, so earlier. But let's go back to why it's so important for us. Now, it's also important for Christianity. Basically, another way to look at it is the missing link. It is the missing link for Jews between the Bible and the Talmud. It's the missing link for Christians between the Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. it directly relates with what's going on during this period that creates development in both sides. So what's going on? Yes, Flossie.
Rabbi, you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. How did they develop? Where was this? Was it in around the Dead Sea?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a group of scrolls that were found near the Dead Sea in the area of Qumran. If you've gone to Arad, Israel, or gone to the Dead Sea, you've been close to it. Now, scientifically, I'm not sure, but they were in bottles, and because of it's the lowest level on Earth that they were survived. And so there are a lot of these scrolls that are in Hebrew, Aramaic, wide range of languages. But what is important is it proves a lot of things. Like, for instance, in the New Testament, the Apocrypha, we have the Apocrypha in certain languages, Latin or Greek, but you can only date the Apocrypha 1,000 years ago because we don't have any older scripts. Now we have the Apocrypha proven to be around in the year 0 and later, like all the other books. So we have copies of these books in the original Aramaic, some in Hebrew, some in other scripts. So we can prove the Apocrypha existed at this time period now. Whereas before we could only say it did, but we could never prove it because we didn't have anything old enough to prove it. We can also prove a lot of these books were in Hebrew. That's why it's more important for Judaism, not the Apocrypha, but the Bible. We have it in Hebrew. We know for a fact around the year 0 that every book of the Bible was in Hebrew, written down, except for Esther. And that was an incredible achievement because the oldest Hebrew Bibles we had were only 1,000 years old, and now we have them 2,000 years old in terms of copies. So the Apocrypha became important because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because of the change in the way we looked at everything. But remember, there's a lot of languages here. A lot of the Apocrypha was around, but in languages that were not the original languages, in Ethiopic and Syriac. So they had copies, but they didn't have anything in Aramaic or Hebrew or original Greek. And now they did. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls did. So not all the Apocrypha are found, but I think most of it. So any other questions before we continue, by the way? Sorry. Larry.
Yeah, I was just looking at I happen to have a King James version of the Bible here, and it has the Apocrypha in it, and it lists 15 books. Maybe they combined the first and second book of Maccabees, but
there's 15? I thought there were 14. I guess I'm wrong.
But one of the things I noticed just in the listing of the books in the Apocrypha, of the 14 of the 15 books seem to deal with the Old Testament or with Jewish wisdom. There's one book that's called The Wisdom of Jesus, which is, which would be unusual for it to be. So I guess Jerome not only looked at Hebrew books, he must have looked at books that were related to Christianity as well.
Every one of these books is related to Judaism. The book of Jesus, I think, is.
I don't know if that's because Jesus.
Well, there's 14 books, but there are pieces of other books that are added, and they may have included that as a book. But sometimes they change the. There's a book called The Wisdom of Joshua ben Sirah, and sometimes they call it The Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirah.
Oh, okay.
So that's a different thing. Again, it's just how you look at it. It's easy. That book is also Ecclesiasticus. So again, it's and we'll talk about that in a little bit about the book themselves. But yeah, they're mostly from the Jewish world, although there are some written in the 1st century, so after Jesus has lived and died. So there are still. So go ahead, Jeff. Larry.
One other question. I noticed the first 2 books are the books of, it's called Esdras, which I imagine is Ezra. Is that right?
It is not.
Oh, it's not Ezra. Okay.
It is not. No, I don't believe so. It's
Yeah.
spelled differently.
That's
And we'll go over those books in a second. Yeah, it is. I mean, we'll go over in generalities because there's a lot of book, but that's they're basically two, it's basically a history book. But they have a very specific nature to it, a very specific liturgy. Series of books that are essential for understanding what's going on. So what is going on at this time period that is elucidated through these books that is so important to Judaism and Christianity? Probably even more so to Christianity than Judaism, but certainly to Judaism. You have to remember the books of the Bible that made it in are older, and so they're missing some things that Christian theology brings to pass. For instance, the Bible we have doesn't deal a lot with the next world. It begins to touch on it, but it isn't become part of our theology as of yet to the level it is today. The idea of the next world being a place where we're rewarded or punished only comes in towards the very end of our Bible, because really the next world was considered kind of like you go underground and you go to the next world with everybody else. They didn't have this really developed theology about what happens. That comes through the rabbis. But we're going to see it in the Apocrypha before the rabbis start creating their own theology. It's a missing link. We don't have other books from this time period except for these. So that's one, is the theology of the next world is essential to understanding what's going on. Secondly, what is the situation going on at the time? It is a very difficult century and a half for the Jews of this period, of this area. You've got 3 wars with Rome. We lose all of them. You've got civil war between the Jews, namely between the Pharisees and Sadducees. You got zealots who want to rebel against Rome. You've got a burgeoning religion that is starting to compete. So, and plus all the other wars and stuff going on. So this is a very trying age. And so that is going to speak a lot about to the development of these books and what's going on. These are not books in terms of, you think of the Talmud, as dealing a lot of legal stuff, a lot of stories that add to legal stuff. That is not what we're finding in the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is very different than that. They are dealing with theology, the duality of the time. They're dealing with the next world and the issues of what's going on in their world. So basically, when you read these books, it is debating Israel versus humankind. It's debating the earthly world versus the heavenly world. It's debating the righteous and the wicked. And it's a time where people are dealing with all of these. But most importantly, I don't know if it's most importantly, but most specifically, it is a period in which the differentiation between Christianity and Israel and Judaism comes to light. And it has to do with one type of literature, and that is the apocalyptic literature, or the belief, which is not really found that much, a little bit in the Bible again, but it's one of the main themes that's going on in the Apocrypha, because the Apocrypha is written during this. Oh, sorry. Jerome is 382. I found it. Sorry, 382.
Right. 379 and 382.
So I don't think he was originally asked to find new books. He was originally asked to do translations, and then he found the new books, and somehow they were put in. That's probably a story that's very interesting, but I'm not familiar with it. So the Apocrypha itself, and again, there's 14 books, I believe, but there's also pieces to other books or additions to other books that had already been written, which are really interesting. They're divided into a couple of categories, and that's important for us. One would be history, simple history books, most notably, as I mentioned before, the books of the Maccabees, which we'll talk about extensively in a second. Also, the book that you just mentioned of Esdras. There are short stories. There's wisdom literature, which is in combination with books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So let's first look at the impact of this apocalyptic vision of the world. Now, in Judaism, how often do we talk about the Messiah and the next world in comparison to Christianity? Do we talk about that stuff more or less?
More.
Less.
Probably less. Some would say more today. But in Christianity, Jesus is the central figure. He's a messianic figure. You talk about him all the time. In Judaism, we talk about the Messiah possibly coming, but our concentration is supposed to be on this world. Why? In Christianity, they talk about the next world way more than we do. They talk a lot about the next world. That's just part of the theology. We have the same theology, and Judaism has the next world. But I'm often asked by Jews, why don't Jews believe in heaven? The Jews ask me this because we don't talk about it that much. Why? Because this idea of heaven and the next world and the apocalypse and the Messiah is all in this period. Think about the year 0-ish. This is when this is all coming together. You've got the Romans coming in. The Romans are at war with people. You've got people of different religions coming into this area, speaking different languages. You got rebellions. You got civil war. You've got people being put on the cross, as we know what happens in Jerusalem. You've got all of these things coming. It's a very difficult time. And in difficult times, what do you tend to do? And it's in Judaism as well. The more difficult the time, the more you think about the next world, or you think about God punishing those who are punishing you. And this is the time period where this is all coming in. And this is why it is so much more a part or spoken about in Christianity than Judaism, because Christianity is in its infancy when they're talking about the Messiah, the end of the world, the next world. Whereas in Judaism, we've been around 1,500 years. So it's the analogy I give is it easier to learn a language at 75 or at 3 or 4 or 5?
Be 3 or 4 or 5.
So when you're little, your brain is absorbing all of this stuff and it goes right into your DNA. Whereas we get older, we're already set in our ways and we can learn languages, of course, but it's a lot more of a struggle and not everybody can do it. Where almost every kid at 2 or 3 or 4 is learning a language, unless there's some sort of issue there. And so it became part of the Christianity vernacular, this idea of the Messiah, this idea of the next world, the idea of the apocalypse. Whereas in Judaism, it's still a part of our world, but it generally becomes much more of a part of our world when we're in difficult times. You know, the Holocaust or Spanish Inquisition or the pogroms of the 18th century and 19th century in Russia and in the Pale Settlement. That's when this apocalyptic vision, this is when we think the world's going to end and you oppressors are going to be taken down and I'm going to laugh at you for the rest of eternity, which we don't think of today because right now we're, the world is going crazy, but the Jewish world is not at its point now where we think it's the end of times. So we're not believing this. So that is really one of the significant factors. Yet Jews at the time were feeling this. And it's essential for us to know that Jews felt this at the time, even though it's not in the Bible, because the books of the Bible written much earlier. So the books of Esdras are about this apocalypse and what's going to happen in the future. And it's really a different type of literature than what we're used to. It's in some ways prophetic, but in some ways very different than the prophets. Let me explain. A prophet, like we have Isaiah, Jeremiah, the books of the prophets, is a person who comes and says, you better behave or bad things are going to happen. That's their job. So what does this mean? This means we have the power to change or create the future. If the 7 of us behave, the future is going to be better for us. 1, 2, 3. If I am better at math because there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If the 9 of us behave, if the 9 of us don't behave, guess what? Bad things are going to happen. And that's the prophets. Apocalyptic literature is not the same. This is the future, period. There is going to be a future apocalypse, and what you do does not affect it. It's going to happen. And that's a very different, and that can be told, that's a real big difference of the age. If you're in a time period where you feel completely powerless, you're probably looking more at apocalyptic visions. I am powerless. The world's going to end. And in the next world, I'm going to be in heaven and all's going to be good. We're in the prophetic age. I can be a better person and I can help us change our world to make it better. This is what the Reform movement is founded on, not the apocalyptic vision of the Apocrypha or the Estros, but the 2 books, but on the prophetic vision of Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hosea, all these books. So that's probably one of the main reasons these books didn't make it in, because the rabbis didn't want to have this apocalyptic viewpoint, even though they were in a different age. Because by the time the Bible's probably chosen, things have calmed down a bit. They're going to get worse 40 years later, but they have calmed down. There is now a trajectory for Christianity, and the Roman wars are over. So for now, there's going to be another bigger one later. So that is why it's essential to understand that Judaism really centers on the prophets opposed to the apocalyptic vision. Christianity does both, because they do have what they call the Old Testament, but they also have apocalyptic books in the New Testament beyond what we find in the Apocrypha. So what's the famous book from the New Testament that deals with this? It's called, I really need to bone on my New Testament stuff, sorry. It's called, the books of the New Testament. It's the one where, what's it called?
Where's our friend here when we need him?
Where's Sam?
Where's Sam?
He doesn't.
All right. It's called, what should I work it? Oh my goodness. It's not a hard book. Here it is. It's got to be here somewhere. There, I know I can find the books of the New Testament on the computer.
It's Revelations.
Revelations. Thank you. Revelation. Thank you. So Revelation is one of them, but there are others as well. And so that they deal with this. Our books do not deal with that vision at all, even though they were living it. So basically, the rabbis or whoever the sages were who chose the books of the Bible purposefully decided not to choose this apocalyptic literature. They also chose not to take the books of the Maccabees, which are a history. And that is probably the most important of the historical books that we have, because everything we know about the Maccabees really comes from these 2 books. Why were the books of the Maccabees not selected? It's a very obvious answer. But first, let's look at the books themselves. There are 2 books of the Maccabees. One comes from the position of the Sadducees. These are the upper class who are connected to Rome, connected to the priest. And one of the books of the Maccabees comes from the Pharisee sect, which are the proto-rabbis, which are the Jews who wanted to study and really wanted to care more about being good human beings, the kind of the more prophetic group. So there's one book from each, which are used for history. Why did they not make it into the Bible? Because it seems like it could. And we'll talk about books that were written during the same time that didn't make it. The main reason is probably because the rabbis did not like the Maccabees. That's why. The Maccabees took back Israel, which was very supported, obviously. They cleaned out the temple, which was important. But the later generations of the Maccabees did a lot of the things that the Pharisees did not like. 1, they became corrupt. Two, they did something that was never allowed in biblical times, is the Maccabees took the kingship and the priesthood. The priesthood and the kingship had always been separated since the moment of Moses and Aaron, and yet they took both of them because they were from a lesser known Cohen clan. So they decided they were going to be the priests and the kings, which is a big no-no. And because they would become the Sadducees, what the Pharisees were fighting against, the Pharisees went out and obviously decided not to put this book that was centered on the Sadducees, centered on this group of people who combined the kingship and the priesthood together, that it becomes so corrupt. That is why they don't make it in. So there's history books that really help us understand what went on. Obviously, there's other pieces. There are coins and other mementos that we find from the period, but those are the best two because they're only written, a couple of decades afterwards. So in living memory.
This is the spelling Apocrypha.
Rabbi, question?
Yeah. Yes.
I understand Jerome's job, as you said, was to codify the Christian Bible at the time, right?
I don't know if it was just to do that or find the translations.
Okay.
And
but
then
he
who
found
was
new books.
and then he found the new books, right?
And somehow they became part of.
Somehow we got them included in, right? But we have to look up how that was done. That would be an interesting story.
We're talking now about the exclusion of the Maccabees from the Jewish Bible.
Exactly. So the Jewish Bible is
now that occurred earlier, right?
Yeah, somewhere around the year 90 CE.
So why?
So 90. So after the destruction of the temples, the year 70, and then 90, and then there's a Jewish place of study set up by a very famous rabbi of the day, Yochanan ben Zakkai, and that would, they believe, 20 years later, they set the books of the Bible. We're pretty sure that they were aware of the Apocrypha. Obviously, now with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that we can prove they were there in certain language. Now, remember, the Apocrypha has been around. We've had it. We just didn't have it in the original Hebrew or Aramaic, which we now have pieces of those, which we didn't have before. So, but yeah, they just weren't put in. There's a lot of reasons. That's probably the most obvious. Also, adding additions to books. There are a few additions to books. They may have just said, we don't want to add these additions, or maybe they weren't familiar. They may not have been familiar with all of the books of the Apocrypha, but they certainly were aware probably of the books of Maccabees and some of the other more famous books that were well known at the time. The additions to Daniel, or the additions, there's several additional stories that come to Daniel that were not put in. And the book of Baruch is basically just an addition to the book of Jeremiah, because Baruch was one of the disciples who worked with Jeremiah. In fact, some people say Baruch actually wrote the book of Jeremiah, but they didn't put those in. So now the Maccabees is an interesting time period because it is a time period of, I'm sorry?
Wait for him to get into it.
And somebody have questions? Sorry. I'm sorry, Flossie. I go back and forth for the notes. I should just keep
That's
this.
okay.
I have to do that.
You want us to wait? Rabbi, do you want us to wait till you finish?
No, I'd rather you have questions, because your questions lead to better answers and you know more than I do anyway.
We always say that, but thank you. Two quick questions. One, do you think Hanukkah wouldn't have, well, I know it's a minor holiday, but wouldn't have the importance that it has if it weren't coming around Christmas and Jews looking to have something to hold on to?
Oh,
at that
100%. Hanukkah was never a major holiday until recent days. In fact, the rabbis very clearly didn't even want the holiday. They really tried to, what's the word, kind of get rid of it slowly but surely, but people remembered the story of the Maccabees. It was a really famous story. It's like saying, I'm not happy about what happened in World War II. We're not going to do anything, and no holidays for World War II remembrance. Well, people remember World War II. People have families and grandparents who served in World War II. You cannot get rid of the memory And if you try to, you're just going to have people push back and want it more. So what they did is basically say, well, we're going to keep this holiday, but it's going to be a minor holiday for people who just want to celebrate it, but we're not going to do that much. So, so that's what they tried to do. And obviously in the 20th and late 19th century and 21st century, Hanukkah became a big deal because of Christmas becoming a bigger deal. So I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say my next question was, how did the people take the issue that came up about the next world and a Messiah? Whether there are groups that were against it or they all jumped?
Oh yeah, there was a wide range of groups. Have you ever see the movie Monty Python and the Life of Brian? Where you're just walking by and there's a messianic character every 3 steps, there's another guy preaching about the end of the world. It's just like, so it was a time period where there are a lot of these characters are going around, and because of all the issues going on in the world. So it was a very different, so there were going to be those who supported the idea, those who were against it. Obviously, the rabbis didn't want to put the apocalyptic character into the Bible for good reason in many respects, because Judaism had always been more of a looking towards what are we supposed to do today as opposed to looking to the future or worrying about the next world. Now, a lot of these books, again, we found in the original languages, we think, which is Aramaic and Hebrew, which really, again, goes a long way, because we did have a lot of these books. For instance, the book of Enoch, we did not have in any of the older languages. And so finding it really, again, proved that it had been around for a long time. Now, as for the Maccabees are a time period where things are going crazy as well. And this is a time period where there's a civil war in Israel. This is 2 centuries earlier, 160, 164, I think, is when it starts in BCE. So you'll see some of the apocalyptic viewpoints or books are probably written as late as this. And one of the things you do is you write a book about a terrible time period, like, oh, we're writing a book as if we're in Babylon. All right. I'm writing a book about Babylon and how everything is terrible, but don't worry, things are going to turn out for the best. I can write that book because this happened centuries ago, so I already know the outcome. So I know we're going to eventually go, after we get kicked out, we're going to go back to Israel. And so what you can do is at the time of the Maccabees, you can write a book about the destruction of the temple 400 years earlier and say, don't worry about it, everything's going to be okay. And that's kind of how you can write this type of literature, but instead of talking about your present situation, you talk about the past. And so now, the earthly and heavenly world, again, is something that is fairly new at this level. But I want to make, because we're running out of time, I want to make sure to go through some of the books. So we can go through a couple of just the books themselves before any questions before I go to the books? All right. So obviously we talked a little bit about the 2 Maccabees books and a little bit about Esdras.
I want to mention about the Maccabees that, in the 1930s, when the Maccabean Games were formed, they adopted that name because I think they wanted to show, the pride of the Maccabees, the strength, the vitality. And just by coincidence, I got involved again with the stamp club here in Sun City. And I was looking through my Israeli stamp album, and I was really surprised at the number of issues that Israel has made, showing the Maccabees. Not only the games, but the Maccabees are kind of like, all over, the symbol of, strength and heroism and, a strong country. So I think with the founding of, in addition to the commercialism of Hanukkah, I think the Maccabees are showing the image of a strong army.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that the rabbis want to get rid of them, and 1,000 years later, they're bigger than ever. They've made a huge comeback. So that's exactly right. The modern state of Israel really looked to find heroes who were military, who were, underdogs who overcame incredible odds, and the Maccabees are probably that more than almost anybody. Jeff.
Yeah, the Maccabees are also studied in military history because they're really the first successful guerrilla movement against an organized government army.
And most importantly, they win. And they don't win.
Oh, that is important.
Yeah, and it's not like they did well and they won the gold and they kept the gold. They had the drug tests and their gold wasn't taken away so they won and they stayed in power for over 100 years until the Romans. So that's one of the reasons, because the Jews went to war with Rome 3 times and did really well each time. So you can look at that, but in the end they lost, and they lost really badly, and the repercussions each time were worse and worse and worse. So what are some of the other things we read about in these books? Well, let's go to a couple of them. There are short stories, Tobit or Tobias sometimes, and Judith are short stories. Tobit is a little bit kind of like Proverbs, and that it talks about if we follow the religious parts of Judaism, we're going to be rewarded. So it's about being a good person, but also following the religion. Judith is kind of another Esther. It's about a woman who's living during the time of the Assyrians, who are the ones who destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. And she kind of goes to the enemy camp and helps the Jews beat the Assyrians. And so this is one of those books that you wonder why it didn't make it in, but probably because they didn't want that many books about women heroes. And so they left it just for Esther. Esther is heroic, but not as heroic as Judith by any. So maybe they wanted a heroic woman, but not somebody too heroic. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so,
we will not talk about her methods.
Yes. Now, when it comes to Book of Daniel, that's probably the most interesting in terms of extras, because there are several extra stories to the Book of Daniel. And the Book of Daniel is one of those books that doesn't really fit in any category in the Bible. He's not a prophet. He's living during the time of Babylon. This is a story written later, so they know. So that these are some apocalyptic stories that could have been put in the Book of Daniel that were not done. And so there's also a prayer. Remember, the Book of Daniel is about Nebuchadnezzar, Jews living abroad, and how Nebuchadnezzar was trying to kill these Jews, and each time a miracle happened. And so it's just basically about how these people are saved by God, and they did not, whether these were originally in the Book of Daniel and taken out, or they were added and then weren't put in. We don't know, but there's a song of praise. There's another story of how Daniel was saved. There is an addition to the book of Esther. There's an extra dream of Mordecai, and a dream telling Mordecai what's to happen in the future. That was either, again, taken out of the book of Esther or was an addition that was not included. And Baruch adds another section or prayer to the book of Jeremiah, which is one of the most important prophetic books. And so there's a lot of, it's a combination of books on their own, pieces that are added to others, apocalyptic history, and wisdom literature, including the wisdom of Joshua ben Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, and which is very different than Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiasticus is basically in many ways the opposite of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is about questioning the religion, whereas Ecclesiasticus is about supporting what's going on and supporting the great leaders, whereas Ecclesiastes is going around questioning everything and basically sarcastically making fun of everything. So that's why he's one of my favorite books. But you have to have both. You can't have one with the other. If you only have books questioning the religion, oh, sorry, go ahead, Noel.
Yeah, what happened to just the ordinary people who were the shoemakers and, that did the ordinary jobs? Were they just excluded from everything, or
No,
were
they're
they
not
part?
excluded. You see a lot of them throughout the Bible, but they're not always the main figures, because the main figures who are like that are usually the prophets. Somebody like Jonah, who's just a regular guy who's made to be a prophet. But it was not, our books are less so than, say, the Greek books that only concentrate on the heroes, but generally they're still concentrating on the main characters. So they have other characters all the time, a lot better than probably other literature of the day. But you're right; it often, talks about the major characters.
The Jewish Canterbury Tales.
That's right. It is not. It is definitely not that for the most part. There are periods when you do, but generally when you're spoken of, that means you're elevated to a higher level. So, but the prophets themselves were not big shots until many of them were, until God said, you're a prophet. Some of them were just regular guys who weren't really, important in terms of prestige. Any other questions? And what I think also, when you come to Ecclesiasticus, it does talk a little bit about the life after death, which is not something that is spoken about in our Bible very much. That may have been why it was not added, because they may not have wanted that theology at that point for some reason.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that, because I'm just looking at the paragraph called "The Wisdom of Solomon."
Right.
The title on that is "The Promise of Immortality."
Right.
And that is kind of conjures up the Christian belief, of life immortal. And, their big selling point was, that you're going to go on living forever. I guess in Judaism, you live forever in the memories of people, but, physically, and spiritually, it's different.
Well, and again, the Wisdom of Solomon would be in the same area of Ecclesiasticus, even more so the opposite of Ecclesiastes. And you're right. It's about doing what you're supposed to do, following the letter of the law, and you will go to heaven, which again is not what Proverbs is about. Following the letter of the law and everything will be okay, but it doesn't deal with the next world that much, Michael.
When we talk about the next world, one of the things that has always struck me, and I could be really off base here, is that it seems like Christianity, we talk about Jewish guilt, and I think biblically, you have more Christian guilt than you have Jewish guilt. And that one of the reasons to emphasize life after death is to control people, to instill fear. And that's just not what we do. We say, yes, you have a better life if you follow the rules. That's what the prophets said. They won't be doom on you. But in terms of the next life, which is clearly a longer period of time than now, it's always seemed to me that the Christianity, uses that to instill fear and control. The fear leads to control of people's behavior.
There's always going to be people like that. I don't know I doubt that was the original intent, but there's always going to be people like that who use what they have to create fear and can keep power. So that may have been one of the reasons they decided not to use it. That certainly could be, because they left. The book of Proverbs is in there, in the book of Ecclesiastes. So they're not afraid of questioning the religion, because that's what Ecclesiastes and Job does. They are books that question the religion, not morality, but question a lot of the things that are going on. So, which is really quite amazing. How did Song of Songs, a very lurid tale, how did that make it in? How did Ecclesiastes and how did Job make it in, which are wisdom, but are questioning, which really is essential, because if you don't have those books in there, you're basically saying you can't question the religion, especially Job, which questions, even God. So But the Apocrypha is really interesting for us to see how life was at this time period and what choices the rabbis made. And then you can't really analyze the choices the rabbis made for choosing the books of the Bible unless you know what their options were. I mean, you can say they chose these books, but if you don't have what the books they didn't choose were, you really can't. And we know that these books were written and available. We don't know if they had access to them or not, but we do know they were there, and at least some of them were almost certainly known to them. So we can determine a lot, maybe even more, but what they didn't choose as opposed to what they did choose. And we know if they had access to it, they left the wisdom of Solomon out, they left the Maccabees out, they left Esther's out. Some of them are really easy to understand why they left them out. Some are a lot harder as to why they left them out. Why did they leave these certain dreams and visions of Daniel out? Why did they leave this extra dream and Esther? Maybe they didn't have it. Maybe they didn't want it. Flossie.
How long did it take them to write this? Was it years or?
Well, the theory is, and this is only a theory, that in the year 90-ish CE, a group at this academy got together with all the books and chose which ones got in. And now we would imagine also because of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Apocrypha, which translations got in. Because from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see there are some slight alterations or differences in books like Isaiah and other books they had. From the Apocrypha, we also see that there's additions to Daniel, to Jeremiah, to Esther that were not put in either. Whether they had access to it or not, we don't know. But certainly Jerome did 200 years later, and we know all these books were written before those guys got together in the year 90. Why do we know? Because we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and on the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have a certain type of paper or a certain type of papyrus or a certain type of sheepskin, and so they can date it, which is amazing. So we know these books were at least written. If we don't know they had access to them, we do know they were there. And we know they were in Alexandria at a certain period of time. We know they were in Israel at a certain period of time. We know the books are in the caves before the year 70. And so those were definitively written by then. And so it makes a huge difference when we're discussing the Bible to know that they were written then in Hebrew and they were in Israel for sure. I mean, that is a huge step probably for archaeologists and scientists and theologians. Larry.
Yeah, it brings to mind, we're approaching Purim now. The book of Esther was mentioned a couple of times, both in the Apocrypha and also in the Megillah. Could you talk one time, maybe put it on our list of things to discuss, the Megillahs? I know there's a whole.
Oh, that's a great idea.
There's five Megillahs, I think, or are there?
There's one, yeah, there's five of them, but obviously the one for the book of it, there's one for all the holidays, basically. But the Megillah Esther is the most famous because the whole holiday is based on it. Yeah, we could talk about the Megillot. We could do that. That should be certainly one.
How they relate to the Bible and how they relate to, how they came about.
Oh, yeah, I'll add that to the list. And the book of Esther is especially interesting because it's the only book we don't have proof that it existed at this time period because it's the only book in the Bible at which we don't have any piece in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that was
a separate Torah type book, right? The book of
Esther.
That unique.
I mean, we have Megillah's. One of the ones we have in our sanctuary is a really old one, probably not the oldest because it is not a full Megillah because they said different. There have been pieces that have been changed out. So it was probably an old Megillah Esther. At some point, they had to take a page or two out and insert other ones. That's why it's not the oldest in the country.
All right. In general, Megillahs in general.
What does the word Megillah mean? Scroll?
Oh,
Or
just blanking. It's book scroll. It means book, but there's a more specific meaning of it.
thinking of the cartoon Megillah Gorilla, but that's not.
I think it's not just, but I think it's just story. That's basically what it is. But there's another way of saying it.
Cool.
It's each of the books are stories themselves for the most part. Well, not all.
I never thought of the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls as much as your talk today.
Yeah, I mean,
years ago, books found it's a part of history coming in, but here you could see what an important finding it was, and the historians being so thrilled how it brought gray areas more black and white, so to speak.
yeah, and again, the biggest thing is 1,000 years ago, if you said the Bible was written in Hebrew, you could say, well, we can prove the Bible was written in Hebrew in the year 1000, like 1,000 years ago, but that's it. Now we can prove the Bible was definitely in Hebrew 2,000 years ago. So we can prove that 100%. Are we going to find scrolls that are older? Who knows? Probably not, but you never know.
This
So
is just aside. I'm sorry, when you're talking
no, it's
about,
great. I like this. I like that more than what I say. So just keep it up.
no, well, I like what you say. When did Yiddish come about? Because I'm thinking how far back Hebrew goes. When did Yiddish come about?
Yeah, we actually spoke about that about a year ago, and that's a much later language. That's, hundreds and hundreds of years after the story of and it's a combination of several languages that are kind of put together in the Poland, Ukraine area. But we talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it again because it's a year ago. Maybe it was 2 years ago. Let me look up. It was 2 years ago we talked about it.
Mhm.
No, a year ago, 2021. That was a year ago. But I'm going to add the Megillahs. I'll put that instead of the Shanghai Jews. I'll move Shanghai Jews one back, and we'll do Megillahs.
I want to hear how Jews.
We are going to hear about it. We're just going to move it back a week so we can do Megillahs right before Purim.
You get a chance to watch that video on the Shanghai Jews. It is sensational. It's on Netflix. I think I mentioned it last time.
Yes, I will eventually.
Yeah, it's really an excellent, excellent film. So,
Larry.
Larry, do you remember the name of the ones?
but
Shanghai Jews, I think.
no, it wasn't the Shanghai Jews. It had a catchy title to it. I don't recall it now, but it had a real catchy title to it. But it's on Netflix, and if you search probably just based on Shanghai Jews, you could probably find it.
And we can actually do the Megillahs next week. Unless you want to do the Pseudepigrapha next week, we can do Megillahs next week before Purim.
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay. And then, so a reminder, very good. So we're going to do the Megillahs next week. And we'll talk about Esther, but we'll also talk about the others. And then we'll talk about the Shanghai Jews and then the Jewish view of animals. Just a reminder that we will be having Purim live on the 13th for people who want to do the spiel and have fun and do all that stuff. The Megillah reading is going to be virtual only on the 16th. We're doing it with 5 or 6 other congregations. So there's going to be a program where a bunch of people teach for a few minutes, and then we read the Megillah, and you'll see views from 5 or 6 different synagogues from Florida here, I think Tennessee. No.
Yeah, is Aramaic a spoken language or is it just written?
It is both. Actually, it may have been the language spoken during this period we're talking about, but we're not 100% sure. But yeah, it was definitely a spoken language. It also became a written language, and then Jews adapted it to the language of the Talmud because they were living in an area that spoke it when they were writing it.
Rabbi, I noticed in Jennifer's email that she sent out that you're having a special guest speaker on Saturday.
We have a really incredible special guest, Larry Silverman, who is a former U.S. ambassador to several countries, going to be speaking. He's going to speak a little bit about what it's like to be an ambassador, and then he's going to discuss the situation in Ukraine.
Oh, wonderful.
So what we're going to do, because we have rules about eating and staying in the social hall together, usually we would have them speak in the social hall after services. But what we're going to do is we're just going to give a short service and let him speak for about 30 to 45 minutes and take questions. He actually, I think it's something I've spoken with. He has a really interesting and obviously a better understanding of what's going on than probably most of us. So if you look at his bio, he served in a lot of countries. I think he retired in 2020, so very recently as well.
That'll be on YouTube as well if we can.
That'll be YouTube and live. Yeah. We're not going to be able to invite people to ask questions who are on YouTube. That's just too hard. But if you're live, you can ask. If anybody has questions and they're not in services, you can email them to me and I'll ask them. It should be. I've heard him speak. He's an excellent speaker and really knowledgeable of a lot of these things that we are not. I mean, he was actually in it. So, Flossie.
Rabbi, when do you foresee our group getting together live again?
Well, we can decide that now. I think we could talk about it really next month or the month afterwards. It's going to be when you guys want. I'm happy to do it whenever. Obviously, the weather is nice. We could do it outside right now. But you tell me if you guys are ready, we'll do it in March or April. And those who are always going to be virtually as well, but anybody wants to do it in person, just bring the bagels and the crackers and what's what I like so much.
Rabbi, and what am I going to do in Houston?
You won't be able to eat the food, but it'll be online. It'll still be on YouTube, but you just won't be able to eat the food.
We never mentioned to her.
We can mail it, and we also look like somebody's going to be hosting an ONEG coming up, and they're going to get food from one of the delicatessens in New York for it. I forget.
Rabbi,
for services. Flossie?
Should Jennifer or someone contacted Ava, who was going to host, and we were concerned it was too early? She's willing to do it.
Yeah, would someone of you want to do it, or I'm happy to do it?
Well, maybe you could pick a date with her.
Okay, I'll give her a call. Let me just send myself a note. Sorry for those people who are not in Cincy, but this class is open for everybody. We're also going to, now as for other programs, March, we're going to be having going back to a lot of programming again. So just to let you know, we have a speaker. We have the speaker, Larry Silverman. We're going to have a 4-part series on the history of immigration to the United States. That's going to be on on Zoom on Wednesday nights. We've got an intro to Judaism that Glenn Kersey is starting to teach. That'll start first Monday in March. It's going to be at 5:00 on Mondays. We're going to start in April having our new singer, hopefully, who will be coming to services as we're going to start working her in. And she is amazing. So that'll start. She's going to be doing 3 of the 5 in April and hopefully most Saturdays. We're going to have hopefully a once-a-month guitar player for Friday nights, a song leader who we just had last week, and he's agreed. He's a SCAD student, so he's here for another year, and he's agreed pretty much to do as much, maybe once a month, and he is incredible. So if you like that kind of service, then that's really, and we didn't really publish it last time because we had to really work out a lot of kinks with the technology because we're not set up for video with a guitar player singer, and so it went all right, but I mean he was amazing if you were there, but if you're watching online, I know there were some issues there they have to fix, so we'll publicize it more for the next time.
Is Jennifer going to send out a lot of what
it should have gone out yesterday or this morning.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then just to let you know, we also have a movie. We're going to be opening a movie at a synagogue called The Levees of Monticello. It's about how the descendant of one of our descendants saved Monticello and about the anti-Semitism in Monticello. We're going to have a concert also with the Jewish, the Federation's Jewish thing. And then we're looking at probably, which is not announced, we're going to be having a movie night with Asbury Asbury Memorial Church and the mosque, about a movie that we're going to probably invite people to go probably to the Asbury to watch, and it's going to be a discussion. Also, when we show the movie on Admiral Levee, I just learned recently it's pronounced Levy in his case. They're going to have the director of the movie is also going to be there.
What date is that, Rabbi?
That's the 13th. It's the same day as Purim. Like, we're going to have a Purim thing at 12:30 with the families outside or in the. Oh no! Wait a minute. No, that the 13th is the guitar player. Sorry, we're now going back to a lot more events than we've had recently. The movie is going to be then on what, the 27th maybe. The
That's
movie is
March?
on the.
I'll be looking at Jennifer's.
That movie will be streamed as well. I think it's part of the Savannah Jewish Film Festival.
Yeah.
It's one of the
I thought it was on the 20th, but maybe it's on a Saturday night. Maybe it's on the 6th. The movie's on the 6th. It's the week before. Sorry. So I have not seen it, but I'm looking forward to seeing it because I know the story a little bit. We had the author of the book come and speak a few years ago. So those are just some of the things. Any other things you want? I'm going to go get some bagels right now because I'm doing lunch in Midtown Deli, but you all invited. If the person I'm going with is paying, I'll probably get some sable. If she's not, then I'm probably going to egg salad.
Did he say the movie is the 6th?
Your sense of humor not changed.
One more time.
Overall, I said your sense of humor after all these years I've known you has not changed.
Thanks. That I think I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult though. I guess.
It's a compliment.
Well, thanks
I'm
again.
not-
Thank you.
Thanks again, guys. And if there's anything else you want me to teach on, right now I'm only teaching on Wednesday mornings. Glenn is doing the tour study and the Monday study session, so I'm happy to start teaching something else. I should have probably, I thought about doing the intro to Judaism, but because it was in the evening, I want to get home and see my kids, so I didn't want to have that every Monday.
Thanks, Rabbi. Take care.
Thank
Enjoy.
you, guys.
Stay
Stay safe.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Be safe.